I was kissing her when my phone lit up with my daughter's name. Not a quick, harmless kind of kiss. Not the kind you pull away from easily. My hand was at the small of her back, and hers was tangled in the front of my shirt, pulling me closer like she'd forgotten where we were. We were in her apartment, blinds half closed, late afternoon light spilling across the edge of her bed. The air still felt warm from the radiator. I remember the sound of our breathing before I remember anything else. And then the phone buzzed. I should start earlier. Because none of that happened overnight. I'm 38. I teach history at a public high school just outside Denver. I've been there 12 years. Long enough that my classroom smells faintly like dry erase markers and old paper no matter how much I clean it. Long enough that the juniors know exactly when I'm about to make a bad joke about the Constitution. 2 years ago my divorce was finalized. No dramatic scandal. No shouting. Just two people who slowly stopped reaching for each other. My ex-wife and I share custody of our 12-year-old daughter, Lily. She's smart, observant in a way that makes you careful with your words. She sees more than she says. After the divorce, I moved into a small townhouse 10 minutes from the school. Beige walls, cheap carpet, one framed photo in the living room of Lily on her 10th birthday. My days fell into a pattern. Wake up at 6. Coffee. Grade papers at the kitchen counter. Teach. Come home. Heat something in the microwave. Sit on the couch and scroll until I felt tired enough to sleep. It wasn't miserable. It was just quiet. Too quiet. I met her on a Tuesday in September. Her name is Claire. She teaches English, mostly seniors. She transferred in from another district after her previous school cut funding. I noticed her before we ever spoke. Not because she was loud. She wasn't. It was the opposite. She moved like someone used to being watched and judged and choosing not to react. She's 46. That was the first thing people whispered about. Not to her face, of course. In the staff lounge. By the copy machine. She looks good for her age, someone said once, like it was a compliment. Another teacher joked that the seniors probably had crushes on her already. I remember how my jaw tightened when I heard that. The cruelty happened in October. We were in a department meeting after school. The principal was reviewing test scores, pacing slowly in front of the whiteboard. Claire had just suggested a new reading approach for struggling students. It was thoughtful, detailed. You could tell she'd prepared. He laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. That's an interesting idea, he said, tilting his head. Though sometimes we have to accept that certain methods are a bit dated. Dated. The room went quiet in that way rooms do when everyone knows what was meant but no one wants to name it. Claire nodded once. Calm. Professional. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap. I watched her face. Not anger. Not embarrassment exactly. Just something small and contained. Like she'd heard it before. I didn't plan to speak. I'm not the confrontational type. I usually keep my head down. But something in me shifted. With respect, I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. Her approach is backed by recent literacy studies. I read about something similar last year. It might be worth piloting before we dismiss it. The principal looked at me, surprised. A couple of teachers nodded. The moment passed. The meeting moved on. But when we filed out, Claire stopped beside me in the hallway. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I know, I answered. But he was wrong. She studied me for a second. Like she was deciding whether I meant it. Thank you, she said. And then she walked toward her classroom. That could have been the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, I found her alone in the staff parking lot. It was almost dark. She was sitting in her car but hadn't started it. Just staring at the steering wheel. I hesitated. Then I knocked lightly on the window. She rolled it down halfway. Are you okay? I asked. She gave a small smile. I'm fine. You don't look fine. There was a pause. The kind that stretches. It's just been a long week, she said. I keep feeling like I have to prove I belong here. Like I'm already behind. You're not, I said. And I meant it. She let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. You're kind, I'm practical, I replied. And I've seen your lesson plans. The seniors actually talk about your class. That never happens. That made her laugh for real. A soft, surprised sound. We stood there longer than necessary. Cold air creeping in. Neither of us quite ready to leave. That was the beginning. At first it was small things. Running into each other in the hallway. Sharing coffee in the break room. Texting about lesson ideas. Then texting about other things. Music. Books. The way teenagers somehow all say the same 5 phrases. 2 weeks later, we stayed late grading essays and ended up talking until the custodian flicked the lights twice as a hint. She told me she'd been married once. Briefly. No kids. I focused on my career, she said, but it didn't sound like a brag. It sounded like something she was still explaining to herself. I told her about Lily. About how quiet the house feels on the weeks she's with her mom. Claire listened. Really listened. Not waiting for her turn to speak. By November, we had a routine. Coffee on Wednesdays after school. A diner near campus where the waitress called everyone Han. We'd sit in a booth by the window. Talk about everything except the thing hovering just under the surface. Sometimes our knees brushed under the table. Neither of us pulled away. The first time I went to her apartment, it was because her sink was leaking. At least that's what we told ourselves. I knelt under the cabinet, tightening a loose pipe. She stood behind me, arms folded, watching. You don't have to fix everything, she said. I know, I answered. But I can fix this. When I stood up, we were closer than before. Close enough that I could see the faint line at the corner of her eye when she smiled. Close enough to notice she was nervous. We should be careful, she said. Probably. Neither of us moved. That night we didn't kiss. We sat on her couch, shoulders touching, watching a show neither of us paid attention to. My hand rested near hers. Not touching. Just there. It took 3 more weeks before that line disappeared completely. And when it did, it wasn't reckless. It wasn't planned. It was just inevitable. But even in those early days, before the phone buzzed, before Lily saw anything, before my wife and I had the hardest conversation of our lives, there was already something real growing between us. Something steady. Something that felt like waking up after a long time asleep. And I knew, even then, that crossing that line would change everything. The first time we really talked, it was raining. Not a heavy storm. Just that steady October drizzle that makes the parking lot shine under the streetlights. I had stayed late grading quizzes. When I walked out, I saw her car still there. She was sitting inside, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. Not crying. Just staring ahead like she was trying to gather herself before going home. I almost kept walking. That would have been easier. Safer. Instead, I walked over and tapped lightly on her window. She rolled it down halfway and gave me that polite, practiced smile. The one teachers use when a student asks something they've already answered twice. I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine. Of course she did. I told her she didn't look fine. I remember feeling awkward the second the words left my mouth, but I didn't take them back. There was a pause. Rain tapping on the roof of her car. She stared straight ahead for a few seconds before admitting it had been a long week. She said she kept feeling like she was being measured against some invisible standard, like she had to prove she belonged there. She tried to say it casually, like it didn't matter. But I could hear the weight in it. I told her she did belong. I mentioned the way her students actually stayed after class to keep talking. That never happened in most classes. I said I had seen her lesson plans and they were thoughtful, current, not dated, like someone had implied. At that, her mouth tightened just slightly. So she had heard it the same way I had. She asked why I cared. I didn't have a polished answer. I just told her that I didn't like watching someone be dismissed for the wrong reasons. And that she was good at what she did. That seemed like reason enough. Something shifted then. Her shoulders dropped a little. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. She said she wasn't used to anyone stepping in for her. She had gotten good at handling things alone. I said I knew something about that. That caught her attention. She asked about my divorce? Not in a nosy way. Just careful, like she was testing whether I wanted to talk about it. I told her the truth. That it hadn't been explosive. Just quiet. Two people who slowly stopped trying. That sometimes the worst thing isn't fighting, it's indifference. She nodded like she understood that kind of silence. She admitted her marriage had been short and heavy at the same time. Her ex had wanted her to shrink. To slow down. To stop being ambitious because it made him uncomfortable. When she didn't, he called her cold. Career obsessed. Too much. She said she started believing some of it. I told her I didn't see someone who was too much. I saw someone who prepared for meetings more than anyone else in the department. Someone who stayed late with struggling seniors. Someone who cared. She laughed softly and said I made her sound impressive. I said she was. We ended up standing there in the rain longer than either of us meant to. At some point I suggested we grab coffee somewhere that wasn't a wet parking lot. I made it sound casual. Easy to decline. She hesitated just long enough that I thought she would say no. Then she agreed. The coffee shop near campus was nearly empty. Just a couple of college kids with laptops and an older man reading a newspaper in the corner. We sat across from each other at a small round table by the window. At first we talked about safe things. Students. Curriculum. The chaos of parent emails. Then it drifted. She told me she was 46. Not defensively. Just plainly. Like she was setting something on the table between us to see if I'd flinch. I didn't. I told her I was 38. That I had a 12-year-old daughter who was smarter than I was at her age. That I was still figuring out how to be a single father half the time. She listened closely when I talked about Lily. Asked real questions. What she liked. Whether she played sports. How she handled the divorce. I admitted Lily had handled it better than I had. Kids are resilient until they aren't. I said I worried about getting things wrong. Claire said worrying probably meant I was already doing something right. There was a moment when our conversation slowed. Not awkward. Just quieter. We were both stirring coffee that had long gone cold. She said she sometimes felt invisible. Not in a dramatic way. Just in small daily ways. Being overlooked in meetings. Being called, experienced, with that tone that really meant old. Watching younger teachers be treated like fresh potential while she was treated like maintenance. I told her I understood feeling invisible. After my divorce, I felt like background noise in my own life. Reliable. Predictable. Not exciting. She smiled at that and said predictable wasn't always a bad thing. Some people were tired of fireworks. That stayed with me. We didn't notice how late it had gotten until the barista started wiping down tables around us. We had been there nearly 2 hours. As we stood up to leave, there was this slight hesitation. Like either of us wanted to step back into our separate routines just yet. I offered to walk her to her car even though it was only half a block away. She didn't tease me about it. She just let me. At her car, she thanked me again. For speaking up in the meeting. For the coffee. For listening. I told her she didn't have to thank me for that. She studied me for a second, then said she wasn't used to easy conversations. Ones where she didn't feel like she had to edit herself. I admitted I wasn't either. We stood there in the cool night air, either of us quite ready to say goodbye. There was no dramatic moment. No lingering touch. Just a quiet understanding that something had begun. Before getting into her car, she said we should probably keep things simple at work. Professional. I agreed. That seemed wise. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that maybe we could do coffee again next week. If I wanted. I told her I did. On the drive home, I felt different. Not wildly in love. Not reckless. Just awake. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel quite as empty when I walked in. I found myself replaying small pieces of the evening. The way she had laughed when I called myself boring. The way she had relaxed when she realized I wasn't judging her age or her ambition. It wasn't about attraction yet. At least that's what I told myself. It was about recognition. Two people who had both been told, in different ways, that they were not enough. Sitting across from each other, and quietly disagreeing with that idea. By the time I went to bed, my phone buzzed. A simple message from her. She had gotten home safe. She thanked me again for the coffee. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before replying. I kept it short. Said I was glad we talked. What I didn't say was that something in me had shifted. A small door I had kept closed since my divorce had cracked open. And I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to shut it again. 2 weeks after that first coffee, we fell into a rhythm. It started small. Running into each other, by accident, near the copy machine. Lingering a little too long after department meetings. Sharing articles about lesson plans that slowly turned into sharing songs, then jokes, then pieces of our day that had nothing to do with school. By late October, Wednesdays belonged to us. We would leave campus separately, careful about that, and meet at a diner about 10 minutes away. Red vinyl booths, cracked tile floors, the smell of coffee soaked into the walls. The waitress called everyone sweetheart, no matter their age. At first we sat across from each other. Then one night, when the place was crowded and only one booth was open, we slid in on the same side. I remember noticing the warmth of her leg against mine before I noticed anything else. Neither of us moved. We just kept talking about grading policies and how seniors somehow forgot every deadline at once. It was slow. That's what I tell myself now. It felt slow then too. By November, we were texting most evenings. Nothing dramatic. A complaint about a parent email. A photo of a messy stack of essays. Once she sent me a picture of the sunset outside her apartment window. I sent one back of my kitchen table covered in half-graded quizzes. After a month of this, it stopped feeling like something extra in my life and started feeling like something steady. Expected. One night she called instead of texting. Said her sink was leaking and she didn't trust herself not to flood the place. I offered to come over. I made it sound practical, like it was just about plumbing. Her apartment was small but warm. Books stacked neatly against one wall. A soft lamp in the corner. No clutter. No signs of chaos. I knelt under her kitchen sink and tightened the pipe while she stood nearby, arms crossed, watching me. She told me I didn't have to fix everything. I said I knew, but I could fix this. When I stood up, we were closer than usual. Close enough that I could see the faint crease near her eyes. Close enough to feel the heat from her body. She said we should be careful. I agreed. Then neither of us stepped back. We didn't kiss that night. We sat on her couch, shoulders touching, watching some mindless show neither of us followed. My hand rested near hers on the cushion. Not quite touching. The space between us felt charged in a quiet way. When I left, she walked me to the door. There was a pause. I thought she might say something that would push this back into safe territory. Instead, she thanked me again. Softly. 2 weeks later, in early December, we had our first real work crisis together. A parent had filed a formal complaint about a reading assignment in her class. Claimed it was inappropriate. The principal called her into his office. I happened to be in the hallway when she walked out. Her face was controlled, but her hands were shaking slightly. I asked what happened. She said it was nothing. Just procedure. But I could tell it wasn't nothing. That afternoon, we stayed late drafting a response. Pulling curriculum standards. Referencing district guidelines. She was calm, precise. I watched the way she organized her notes, the way she anticipated every possible counterargument. It struck me then that she wasn't fragile. She was strong. The kind of strong that gets mistaken for cold because it's quiet. When we finished, it was nearly 8. She leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. Said she hated feeling like she had to defend her competence every few months. I told her she shouldn't have to. She looked at me differently then. Not like a colleague. Not quite like a friend either. Something deeper. That night, as we stood in her classroom doorway, the air between us felt heavier than usual. She said she didn't want to complicate my life. That I had a daughter. A history. That people at school talked. I told her I was aware of that. She said she was aware of our age difference too. That she had no interest in being someone's midlife crisis. I almost laughed at that. I told her if anyone was having a crisis, it was me in my beige townhouse eating microwave dinners. She smiled, but her eyes searched my face like she was looking for doubt. I told her I wasn't confused. That I liked being around her. that I felt more myself in the last month than I had in years. The hallway was quiet. Most teachers had left. She stepped a little closer. Not dramatically. Just enough that I could feel the shift. When she finally kissed me, it wasn't rushed. It was tentative. Like we were both testing whether the ground would hold. It did. After that, things changed, but not all at once. By January, we were careful but no longer pretending. We still left schools separately. We kept our doors open during planning periods. We didn't touch in the hallways. But outside of work, the distance disappeared. I started staying at her apartment once or twice a week, always on the nights Lily was with her mom. We would cook simple dinners. Pasta. Stir-fry. Nothing fancy. She moved easily in her kitchen. I would lean against the counter and watch. Sometimes she would reach out and rest her hand against my chest without thinking. A quiet gesture. Familiar. The first night I stayed over, we lay side by side in the dark for a long time before either of us moved closer. I remember the way her fingers traced the line of my arm. Not urgent. Just curious. Like she was memorizing something. When we finally crossed that line fully, it wasn't frantic. It was slow. Deliberate. Years of restraint dissolving in small increments. I felt wanted in a way I hadn't in a long time. Not for what I provided. Not for stability. Just for me. Afterward, she rested her head against my shoulder and didn't speak. Neither did I. The quiet felt earned. Still, the obstacle was always there. By February, whispers had started at school. Nothing direct. Just the way conversations shifted when one of us walked into the lounge. A raised eyebrow from the math department head. A comment about how often we seemed to coordinate lesson plans. One afternoon, a younger teacher made a joke about history and English forming an alliance. He said it lightly, but his eyes flicked toward Claire in a way that felt pointed. That night she said maybe we should pull back. That she had worked too hard for her reputation to risk it. I told her I understood. But the thought of stepping away felt like shrinking again. Like going back to that beige townhouse version of myself. We didn't decide anything that night. We just lay there, facing each other in the dim light. By March, the tension between protecting our careers and protecting what we were building had grown heavy. And then the moment happened that neither of us had planned for. A Saturday afternoon. Lily was supposed to be at a friend's house until evening. Claire and I were in her bedroom, tangled up in each other, careless in a way we hadn't been before. We were kissing, her hand at the back of my neck, my fingers at her waist, when the front door opened. I heard Lily's voice calling for me. And everything shifted. The sound of the front door opening is something I still hear clearly. Lily's voice carried down the hallway, casual, unaware. She was supposed to be out until evening. Plans had changed. No one had told me. Claire and I pulled apart instantly. Not dramatically. Just two adults suddenly aware of how careless we had been. My heart was pounding. Claire stepped back first, smoothing her hair, her face pale but controlled. I remember how quickly she shifted from warmth to composure. Years of being careful had trained her well. I walked out to the living room, trying to slow my breathing before Lily saw me. She stood there with her backpack over one shoulder. She looked from me toward the hallway that led to Claire's bedroom. Then back at me. She didn't say anything at first. That was worse. I told her her friend's mom had dropped her off early. She nodded. Said the sleepover was cancelled. Her eyes drifted past me again. Claire stepped into the hallway then. Calm. Professional. She greeted Lily kindly, like she had every other time she'd met her at school events. Lily answered politely. Too politely. I drove Lily home 10 minutes later. The car ride was quiet. When we pulled into my driveway, she finally asked if Claire was just my friend. I didn't lie. I said she was more than that. Lily looked out the window for a long time. Then she asked if her mom knew. That question sat between us. I told her no. Not yet. She nodded again. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just said she didn't like being surprised. That hurt more than anger would have. That night, after Lily went to her room, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone. Claire had texted to ask if everything was okay. I told her what Lily had seen. There was a long pause before she replied. She said she had always known this would be the hard part. That she didn't want to create tension between me and my daughter. Or between me and my ex-wife. We met the next evening at a small park near her apartment. It was cold. Early spring. The trees still bare. We sat on a bench facing the water. She said she had been careful her entire adult life. Careful with her career. Careful with her reputation. Careful not to give anyone a reason to dismiss her. And now she felt like she had stepped into something that could unravel all of it. I told her I understood that fear. I felt it too. I didn't want Lily caught in the middle. I didn't want to look reckless. She asked if this had been reckless. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I told her it hadn't felt reckless. It had felt honest. Slow. Considered. Like something that had grown quietly and steadily. She looked at me then, searching my face again like she had that night in the hallway. I told her I loved her. The words came out simpler than I expected. No build-up. No dramatic pause. Just truth. She closed her eyes for a second when I said it. Not shocked. Just overwhelmed. She said she had been trying not to use that word. That it complicated things. That it made walking away harder if we had to. I told her I didn't want to walk away. She said she loved me too. There was fear in it. And certainty. We talked about consequences after that. Practical things. Lily. My ex-wife. The school. The whispers that were already starting. The fact that she was 8 years older and people would notice. That some already had. She said she refused to be someone's secret. I agreed. The next conversation was harder. I met my ex-wife at a coffee shop 2 days later. Neutral ground. I told her about Claire. About how long it had been developing. About Lily walking in. She was quiet at first. Then she asked if this was serious. I said yes. She asked about Claire's age. I told her. There was a flicker of surprise. Then a long look I couldn't fully read. Not anger. Not quite approval either. She said she didn't want Lily confused or feeling replaced. I told her that would never happen. That Claire wasn't stepping into anyone's role as a mother. That she was simply someone I cared about. It wasn't a perfect conversation. There were sharp edges. But it didn't explode. That weekend I sat down with Lily again. I told her I should have told her sooner. That she deserved not to be surprised. I told her I cared about Claire deeply, but that my relationship with her came first. Lily listened. Then she asked if I was happy. I said I was. She nodded slowly. Said she just needed time. Time. That word felt fair. Claire and I agreed we wouldn't hide anymore. Not recklessly. Not in ways that disrespected anyone. But honestly. The next Monday, we requested a meeting with the principal and HR. Sitting across from them felt strangely formal. Like we were confessing to something criminal. We explained that we were in a relationship. That it had developed gradually. That we wanted to handle it properly. That we were willing to adjust reporting structures if needed. The principal looked uncomfortable. HR asked procedural questions. There were policies to review. Lines to redraw. But there was no rule against it. Not explicitly. They said we would need to keep professional boundaries visible. No favoritism. No public displays. Transparency. We agreed. Walking out of that office, I felt exposed. But also relieved. Claire squeezed my hand briefly in the hallway when no one was looking. We had said it out loud. To each other. To the people who mattered. There was no going back to pretending now. And even with the fear still sitting in my chest, I felt something else too. We had chosen each other. Not in secret. Not in impulse. In daylight. Going to HR did not quiet anything. If anything, it gave people something official to whisper about. At first it was subtle. Conversation stopping when one of us walked into the staff lounge. A few too long glances during meetings. Someone joking about how history and English must be collaborating very closely this semester. Claire handled it better than I did. She had more practice with being watched. 2 weeks after we disclosed the relationship, an anonymous email was sent to the principal. It questioned whether Claire's judgment could be trusted. It implied she was using me to stay relevant. It used the word desperate. I saw a printed copy of it on the principal's desk during a curriculum meeting. He quickly flipped it over, but not before I caught a few lines. That night, Claire came over to my townhouse for dinner. Lily was at her mom's. I had tried to cook something decent and slightly overcooked the chicken. She told me about the email before I brought it up. She said HR had forwarded it to her as part of transparency. She said she wasn't surprised. That was the part that got to me. The calm acceptance. Like this was the tax she had always expected to pay. I asked if she regretted this. Regretted us. She took a long time before answering. She said she regretted that people still believed a woman in her 40s could not be loved without a hidden agenda. She regretted that her age was the first thing some people saw. But she didn't regret me. Still, doubt crept in. A few days later, I overheard two teachers in the hallway speculating that I was going through a phase. That I would eventually trade up once I got bored. They laughed softly, not realizing I was around the corner. That night, I told Claire maybe this had been selfish. Maybe I had pulled her into something that would damage her reputation more than mine. She looked at me in a way that made it clear she didn't appreciate that framing. She said she had made her own choice. That she was not a victim of my midlife confusion. That reducing it to that was exactly what the gossipers were doing. I apologized. I realized I had slipped into protective mode in a way that made her smaller. She told me the only way through this was forward, not retreat. The real turning point came in April. The district announced that one teacher from each school would present at a regional education conference. It was competitive. Administrators nominated candidates. Claire wasn't nominated. A younger teacher with half her experience was. The explanation was vague. Fresh perspectives. New energy. I saw the way Claire absorbed it. Calm on the outside. Tired underneath. That afternoon, I went to the principal's office. I did not raise my voice. I simply presented data. Her student performance metrics. Her literacy initiative. The documented success of the curriculum she had built after the parent complaint. I made it about numbers. About results. About evidence. He listened. A week later, the nomination list was revised. 2 teachers would attend. Claire's name was added. No announcement was made about why. She found out through email. When she told me, her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright in a way I hadn't seen before. Not because I had intervened, but because her work had been acknowledged publicly. At the conference, she presented on adaptive reading strategies. I sat in the back of the room. Not as her partner. Just as a colleague. She spoke clearly. Confident. Engaged. Afterward, 3 teachers from other districts approached her with questions. One asked for her materials. Another invited her to collaborate on a future workshop. Word traveled back to our school. The whispers did not disappear overnight, but they softened. It became harder to dismiss her as someone coasting on attention. Her competence was visible. Around the same time, I was selected to lead a district-wide curriculum review for social studies. That had nothing to do with Claire. It had been in motion for months. Still, it mattered. We were not a distraction from our work. We were doing our jobs well. One evening in May, Claire and I were walking along the river downtown. The weather had finally warmed. People were out with dogs and strollers. No one was paying us any special attention. She told me she had almost ended things back in February. She had convinced herself she was making my life harder. That Lily would resent her. That the staff would eventually force one of us out. I admitted I had similar thoughts. That the pressure had felt constant. She stopped walking then. Turned toward me. She said she was tired of living small to make other people comfortable. I told her I was tired of pretending steady meant boring. That I had hidden behind routine for too long. She reached for my hand openly. Not checking who was watching. For the first time since all of this began, I felt like we were not bracing for impact. We were standing. That summer, Lily agreed to have dinner with us together. Neutral ground. A casual restaurant near my house. It wasn't perfect. Lily was reserved. Claire was careful. I tried not to overmanage the conversation. At one point, Lily mentioned a book she was reading. Claire lit up and asked thoughtful questions. Not performative. Genuine. I watched my daughter slowly relax. After dinner, in the car, Lily said Claire was different than she expected. I asked what she expected. She shrugged and said she thought it would feel awkward. But it didn't. That was the first time I exhaled fully in months. The gossip at school never vanished completely. Institutions have long memories. But by the time the next academic year began, our relationship had settled into something visible and stable. We were not hiding. We were not apologizing. We were simply there. And slowly, respect replaced suspicion. Not because people changed overnight, but because we stayed. By the time summer settled in, the noise around us had quieted enough that we could hear our own lives again. Not perfectly quiet. Just manageable. Claire's lease was up in July. One evening, sitting on her living room floor surrounded by half-packed boxes, she said she was tired of moving every few years. Tired of temporary. I knew what she was really asking without her saying it directly. I told her my townhouse had space. A second bedroom that mostly held old books and a treadmill I never used. I said it carefully, like an option, not a demand. She didn't answer right away. She just ran her hand along the edge of a cardboard box and said she had not lived with someone in almost 20 years. I admitted I had not done it successfully. We both laughed at that. Softly. 2 weeks later, her books were lining my hallway shelves. Her coffee mugs were in my kitchen cabinet. Her shoes were by the front door beside mine. The first few nights felt new in a quiet way. Not dramatic. Just the awareness of another person breathing beside me every night instead of twice a week. We learned each other's small habits. She woke up earlier than I did and liked the house quiet for the first 15 minutes. I left cabinet doors slightly open without realizing it. She closed them behind me without comment. On the weeks Lily stayed with us, Claire gave her space. She did not try to step into authority. She asked about school. Help with English assignments, when Lily asked. Let Lily decide how close to sit on the couch. One evening in August, I walked into the living room and found the two of them laughing over a line in a novel. Lily was explaining why she thought a character's decision made no sense. Claire listened seriously, then challenged her reasoning gently. I stood in the doorway for a moment, not interrupting. It did not look forced. It looked easy. Professionally, things were steady. Claire's conference presentation had led to an invitation to help design district curriculum guidelines. It was a formal recognition of her expertise. The same administrators who once called her methods dated were now referencing her work in meetings. I was promoted to department chair in the fall. It came with more responsibility, more meetings, and more scrutiny. I made a point to keep our professional lines clean. No joint evaluations. No schedule adjustments that could look biased. We were careful. Transparent. But we were no longer defensive. One evening in late October, almost exactly a year after that first rainy parking lot conversation, we were sitting on the back steps of the townhouse. The air was cool. Leaves scattered across the yard. Claire rested her head against my shoulder and said she felt settled in a way she had not felt in years. I asked what that meant. She said she no longer felt like she was bracing for the next comment about her age, or the next assumption about her worth. She felt seen in a way that did not depend on performance. I told her I felt something similar. That I no longer measured myself against the louder, flashier versions of masculinity that had once made me feel inadequate. I was steady. I was thoughtful. That was enough. The proposal was not elaborate. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday night. We were in the kitchen washing dishes after dinner. Lily was upstairs finishing homework. Claire had flour on her cheek from helping bake cookies earlier. I dried my hands and leaned against the counter. I told her I did not want this to be another chapter that ended quietly. I did not want her to feel temporary in my life. She looked at me carefully, like she always did when something serious was coming. I said I wanted to build something permanent. That I wanted her here not just in the present, but in the future I imagined. I said I wanted to marry her. No speech. No kneeling. Just truth. She went very still for a moment. Then she asked if I was certain. I said I had never been more certain about anything that mattered. She laughed softly, the way she does when she is overwhelmed but happy. She said she had spent years believing she had missed her chance at this. That she had told herself she was fine alone. Then she said yes. Not loudly. Just firmly. We did buy a ring later. Simple. Nothing extravagant. She said she preferred something she could wear every day without worrying. When we told Lily, she stared at us for a long second. Then she asked if this meant Claire would be at all the school plays and parent meetings. Claire answered carefully, saying she would be there for whatever Lily was comfortable with. Lily nodded. Then she hugged Claire first. That moment felt like a quiet blessing. At school, we informed administration again. Transparency had become our habit. There were forms. Policy confirmations. Nothing dramatic. Some colleagues congratulated us genuinely. A few offered tight smiles. But no one questioned our competence anymore. By winter, wedding plans were underway. Small. Intimate. Just family and close friends. Sometimes at night, lying beside her, I would think about how easily this could have folded under pressure. How many moments had required deliberate choice. And yet here we were. Not dramatic. Not perfect. Just steady. Together. We got married on a quiet Saturday in early spring. No ballroom. No huge guest list. Just a small ceremony at a lakeside park about 20 minutes from our house. The kind of place where joggers pass by in the mornings and kids feed ducks in the afternoon. The trees were just beginning to turn green again. Not fully. Just hints of it. It felt right somehow. Not flashy. Just new. There were maybe 30 people there. Close friends. A few colleagues who had become real friends over time. My parents. Her sister. Lily stood beside me. Claire wore a simple ivory dress that moved when the wind picked up. No dramatic veil. No heavy makeup. She looked like herself. Calm. Grounded. When she walked toward me, I didn't feel nerves the way I had expected. I felt steady. The officiant kept it short. We had asked for that. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't read from a card. I just told the truth. I said that loving her had taught me that steadiness was not dull, that kindness was not weakness. I said she had made my life feel awake again. She listened without looking away. When she spoke, she said she had spent years believing she needed to shrink parts of herself to be loved. That with me, she never felt asked to do that. She said I had defended her before I loved her, and that mattered. There was a quiet ripple through the small crowd at that. We exchanged rings. Simple bands. Nothing ornate. When the officiant pronounced us married, there was applause, but it wasn't loud. It felt intimate. Real. Afterward, we had dinner at a small restaurant by the water. Long tables pushed together. No assigned seating. People moved around talking, laughing. I caught snippets of conversation from colleagues who had once whispered. Now they were complimenting Claire's curriculum work. Asking me about the district review process. It was subtle, but it mattered. No one mentioned age. No one mentioned rumors. Lily gave a short toast. She said she was glad I looked happy again. She said Claire had helped her understand books better and people better. Then she rolled her eyes at herself and said that was all she had prepared. Everyone laughed. At one point during dinner, Claire leaned close and told me she felt lighter than she had in years. Not because we were proving anyone wrong, but because she no longer felt like she was fighting alone. That night back at the townhouse, the house felt different. Not new. Just anchored. We stood in the kitchen for a moment, still dressed up, looking at the small mess of wrapping paper and leftover flowers on the counter. I thought about the first time I had walked into this house after my divorce. How empty it had felt. How carefully I had arranged everything to avoid feeling anything at all. Now there were 2 sets of shoes by the door. 2 mugs drying by the sink. Laughter still echoing faintly in the air. The doubters had not vanished entirely. There would always be people who believed we were temporary. That I would outgrow her. That she had taken a risk she would regret. But those voices were quieter now. Because time had passed. Because we had stayed. Because our work spoke for itself. Her literacy program had been adopted district-wide. My department chair role had expanded into a mentorship program for new teachers. We were not a scandal. We were part of the fabric of the place. Later that evening, after Lily went to her mom's for the week, Claire and I sat on the back steps like we had so many times before. She rested her head on my shoulder again. I asked her if she ever thought about that first meeting in the rain. She said she did. She said she almost told me to leave that night. That it would have been easier. I told her I was glad she didn't. We sat there in comfortable silence. Not the kind that feels empty. The kind that feels earned. The wedding was not an ending. It did not fix everything or silence every whisper. But it marked something clear. We had chosen each other in public. In daylight. Without apology. And that felt like victory enough. We got married on a quiet Saturday in early spring. No ballroom. No huge guest list. Just a small ceremony at a lakeside park about 20 minutes from our house. The kind of place where joggers pass by in the mornings and kids feed ducks in the afternoon. The trees were just beginning to turn green again. Not fully. Just hints of it. It felt right somehow. Not flashy. Just new. There were maybe 30 people there. Close friends. A few colleagues who had become real friends over time. My parents. Her sister. Lily stood beside me. Claire wore a simple ivory dress that moved when the wind picked up. No dramatic veil. No heavy makeup. She looked like herself. Calm. Grounded. When she walked toward me, I didn't feel nerves the way I had expected. I felt steady. The officiant kept it short. We had asked for that. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't read from a card. I just told the truth. I said that loving her had taught me that steadiness was not dull, that kindness was not weakness. I said she had made my life feel awake again. She listened without looking away. When she spoke, she said she had spent years believing she needed to shrink parts of herself to be loved. That with me, she never felt asked to do that. She said I had defended her before I loved her, and that mattered. There was a quiet ripple through the small crowd at that. We exchanged rings. Simple bands. Nothing ornate. When the officiant pronounced us married, there was applause, but it wasn't loud. It felt intimate. Real. Afterward, we had dinner at a small restaurant by the water. Long tables pushed together. No assigned seating. People moved around talking, laughing. I caught snippets of conversation from colleagues who had once whispered. Now they were complimenting Claire's curriculum work. Asking me about the district review process. It was subtle, but it mattered. No one mentioned age. No one mentioned rumors. Lily gave a short toast. She said she was glad I looked happy again. She said Claire had helped her understand books better and people better. Then she rolled her eyes at herself and said that was all she had prepared. Everyone laughed. At one point during dinner, Claire leaned close and told me she felt lighter than she had in years. Not because we were proving anyone wrong, but because she no longer felt like she was fighting alone. That night back at the townhouse, the house felt different. Not new. Just anchored. We stood in the kitchen for a moment, still dressed up, looking at the small mess of wrapping paper and leftover flowers on the counter. I thought about the first time I had walked into this house after my divorce. How empty it had felt. How carefully I had arranged everything to avoid feeling anything at all. Now there were 2 sets of shoes by the door. 2 mugs drying by the sink. Laughter still echoing faintly in the air. The doubters had not vanished entirely. There would always be people who believed we were temporary. That I would outgrow her. That she had taken a risk she would regret. But those voices were quieter now. Because time had passed. Because we had stayed. By winter, wedding plans were underway. Small. Intimate. Just family and close friends. Sometimes at night, lying beside her, I would think about how easily this could have folded under pressure. How many moments had required deliberate choice. And yet here we were. Not dramatic. Not perfect. Just steady. Together. We got married on a quiet Saturday in early spring. No ballroom. No huge guest list. Just a small ceremony at a lakeside park about 20 minutes from our house. The kind of place where joggers pass by in the mornings and kids feed ducks in the afternoon. The trees were just beginning to turn green again. Not fully. Just hints of it. It felt right somehow. Not flashy. Just new. There were maybe 30 people there. Close friends. A few colleagues who had become real friends over time. My parents. Her sister. Lily stood beside me. Claire wore a simple ivory dress that moved when the wind picked up. No dramatic veil. No heavy makeup. She looked like herself. Calm. Grounded. When she walked toward me, I didn't feel nerves the way I had expected. I felt steady. The officiant kept it short. We had asked for that. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't read from a card. I just told the truth. I said that loving her had taught me that steadiness was not dull, that kindness was not weakness. I said she had made my life feel awake again. She listened without looking away. When she spoke, she said she had spent years believing she needed to shrink parts of herself to be loved. That with me, she never felt asked to do that. She said I had defended her before I loved her, and that mattered. There was a quiet ripple through the small crowd at that. We exchanged rings. Simple bands. Nothing ornate. When the officiant pronounced us married, there was applause, but it wasn't loud. It felt intimate. Real. Afterward, we had dinner at a small restaurant by the water. Long tables pushed together. No assigned seating. People moved around talking, laughing. I caught snippets of conversation from colleagues who had once whispered. Now they were complimenting Claire's curriculum work. Asking me about the district review process. It was subtle, but it mattered. No one mentioned age. No one mentioned rumors. Lily gave a short toast. She said she was glad I looked happy again. She said Claire had helped her understand books better and people better. Then she rolled her eyes at herself and said that was all she had prepared. Everyone laughed. At one point during dinner, Claire leaned close and told me she felt lighter than she had in years. Not because we were proving anyone wrong, but because she no longer felt like she was fighting alone. That night back at the townhouse, the house felt different. Not new. Just anchored. We stood in the kitchen for a moment, still dressed up, looking at the small mess of wrapping paper and leftover flowers on the counter. I thought about the first time I had walked into this house after my divorce. How empty it had felt. How carefully I had arranged everything to avoid feeling anything at all. Now there were 2 sets of shoes by the door. 2 mugs drying by the sink. Laughter still echoing faintly in the air. The doubters had not vanished entirely. There would always be people who believed we were temporary. That I would outgrow her. That she had taken a risk she would regret. But those voices were quieter now. Because time had passed. Because we had stayed. Because our work spoke for itself. Her literacy program had been adopted district-wide. My department chair role had expanded into a mentorship program for new teachers. We were not a scandal. We were part of the fabric of the place. Later that evening, after Lily went to her mom's for the week, Claire and I sat on the back steps like we had so many times before. She rested her head on my shoulder again. I asked her if she ever thought about that first meeting in the rain. She said she did. She said she almost told me to leave that night. That it would have been easier. I told her I was glad she didn't. We sat there in comfortable silence. Not the kind that feels empty. The kind that feels earned. The wedding was not an ending. It did not fix everything or silence every whisper. But it marked something clear. We had chosen each other in public. In daylight. Without apology. And that felt like victory enough. We got married on a quiet Saturday in early spring. No ballroom. No huge guest list. Just a small ceremony at a lakeside park about 20 minutes from our house. The kind of place where joggers pass by in the mornings and kids feed ducks in the afternoon. The trees were just beginning to turn green again. Not fully. Just hints of it. It felt right somehow. Not flashy. Just new. There were maybe 30 people there. Close friends. A few colleagues who had become real friends over time. My parents. Her sister. Lily stood beside me. Claire wore a simple ivory dress that moved when the wind picked up. No dramatic veil. No heavy makeup. She looked like herself. Calm. Grounded. When she walked toward me, I didn't feel nerves the way I had expected. I felt steady. The officiant kept it short. We had asked for that. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't read from a card. I just told the truth. I said that loving her had taught me that steadiness was not dull, that kindness was not weakness. I said she had made my life feel awake again. She listened without looking away. When she spoke, she said she had spent years believing she needed to shrink parts of herself to be loved. That with me, she never felt asked to do that. She said I had defended her before I loved her, and that mattered. There was a quiet ripple through the small crowd at that. We exchanged rings. Simple bands. Nothing ornate. When the officiant pronounced us married, there was applause, but it wasn't loud. It felt intimate. Real. Afterward, we had dinner at a small restaurant by the water. Long tables pushed together. No assigned seating. People moved around talking, laughing. I caught snippets of conversation from colleagues who had once whispered. Now they were complimenting Claire's curriculum work. Asking me about the district review process. It was subtle, but it mattered. No one mentioned age. No one mentioned rumors. Lily gave a short toast. She said she was glad I looked happy again. She said Claire had helped her understand books better and people better. Then she rolled her eyes at herself and said that was all she had prepared. Everyone laughed. At one point during dinner, Claire leaned close and told me she felt lighter than she had in years. Not because we were proving anyone wrong, but because she no longer felt like she was fighting alone. That night back at the townhouse, the house felt different. Not new. Just anchored. We stood in the kitchen for a moment, still dressed up, looking at the small mess of wrapping paper and leftover flowers on the counter. I thought about the first time I had walked into this house after my divorce. How empty it had felt. How carefully I had arranged everything to avoid feeling anything at all. Now there were 2 sets of shoes by the door. 2 mugs drying by the sink. Laughter still echoing faintly in the air. The doubters had not vanished entirely. There would always be people who believed we were temporary. That I would outgrow her. That she had taken a risk she would regret. But those voices were quieter now. Because time had passed. Because we had stayed.